Welcome to the Central Mind Podcast, and I'm your host, Tony DeVito, where we try and get to the middle ground of almost anything. None of the information provided in this episode should be construed as legal or medical advice. We at the Central Mind Podcast, our guests, affiliates, or any of their affiliates are not liable for any actions taken or decisions made by you from the information provided in this podcast. Please advise an attorney for any legal advice and a medical professional for any medical advice. We have a more detailed disclaimer available to you under the description of this episode. Welcome back to our podcast. This is the third installment of our show, and we're going to be discussing the amendments on the Florida ballot that remain. We discussed already amendments 3 and 4 in our first two episodes. So now we're going to go over 1, 2, 5, and 6, but we're going to do it in a shorter detail in which we did 3 and 4. These ones are not as important to voters, but they are still important and we should go over them. But before we do that, I do want to let you know that this podcast is not always going to be about politics. It's actually going to be more about our society, our culture, and things that are going on in current events and how it affects our daily lives, along with some of my own experiences and interests. We'll also have guests on once I get a little bit more comfortable with actually hosting a podcast and having other people on. With guests, we'll discuss health or their profession or topics that the guest may be very well versed in. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into these amendments and get the show on the road. The first amendment is about establishing school board elections as partisan. So I'm going to just go ahead and read this ballot language. I'm going to try to get through it as quickly as possible. I know some of this stuff can be a bit dry. So the ballot language says, proposing amendments to the state constitution to require members of a district school board to be elected in a partisan election rather than a nonpartisan election, and to specify that the amendment only applies to the election held on or after November 2026 general election. However, partisan primary elections may occur before the 2026 general election for purposes of nominating political party candidates to that office or placement on the 2026 general election ballot. Okay, so put very simply, do you want the elections of school board members to be partisan or nonpartisan? Basically, do you want the individuals to be required to state whether or not they're Republican or Democrat or independent or some other party? Opponents to this amendment would argue that it should be an apolitical decision when voting for school board members, and I agree it should be apolitical, but unfortunately reality shows us that it's not apolitical. Many people exercise politics in their jobs, especially in our schools, and we don't really want our children exposed to ideas that we don't agree with. And therefore, I support this amendment because it will allow me to have a better understanding of the beliefs of the individual that's running for that position, given the alignment of their political party. Because we do know that that typically defines what a person's beliefs are, though they can sometimes be slightly different from the base of their party. We can almost always surmise what an individual's belief system is based on their political affiliation. And that's important for me to know when that individual is going to be in charge of making decisions for my child's education. So if you vote yes on this, it'll change the school board elections to a partisan election where the candidates must list whether they are a Democrat, a Republican, or an independent, or whatever other party they may belong to. All right, let's jump right into Amendment 2, which is establishing a state constitutional right to hunt and fish. The ballot language for this one is proposing an amendment to the state constitution to preserve forever fishing and hunting, including by the use of traditional methods, as a public right and a preferred means of responsibly managing and controlling fish and wildlife. Specifies that the amendment does not limit the authority granted to the Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission under Section 9 of Article 4 of the state constitution. Voting yes on this one would enshrine the right to hunt and fish in the Florida state constitution. If this gets passed, it would be harder for legislators to create laws that would ban or restrict various forms of hunting or fishing. My understanding is that most hunters and fishers down here in Florida typically complain about the fact that you need a license to do so. But voting yes on this doesn't change that. You would still require a license to hunt or fish. Most people I know that hunt and fish are actually okay with the current restrictions and bans that are in place in the state of Florida. I don't hunt or fish myself, but knowing the people that do and the conversations I've had with them, it doesn't seem like voting yes on this makes sense. So for me, I'm going to go ahead and vote no. I would love to actually hear from someone in the hunting community. If you're a listener to this podcast, feel free to reach out to us through any of our social media platforms, or you can email us at centralmindpodcast@outlook.com. And if you're informed enough on this topic, I would love to have you on as a guest in the near future. All right, so we've already gone over Amendments 3 and 4, so we're going to skip those and we're going to go right to Amendment 5, which is about homestead exemption, inflation, and adjustment, and I'll go ahead and read the language. Proposing an amendment to the state constitution to require an annual adjustment for inflation to the value of current or future homestead exemptions that apply solely to levies other than school district levies, and for which every person who has legal or equitable title to real estate and maintains therein the permanent residence of the owner, or another person legally or naturally dependent upon the owner is eligible. This amendment takes effect January 1, 2025. This one's pretty easy for me as a homeowner here in the state of Florida, and I also have homestead exemption. Voting yes on this would increase your exemption from the $25,000 to the amount of increase in the rate of inflation that's stated on the Consumer Price Index. So for example, if the rate of inflation is 8%, it would increase the value of exemption from $25,000 to $27,000, which would then reduce your tax liability on your property, given the fact that as property values continue to go up, taxpayers will continue to pay more on their property taxes. So the ability to reduce your tax liability by increasing your exemption based on the current rate of inflation, I think is a great idea. Of course, opponents to this amendment would say that the amendment will negatively impact local government's tax revenue if it is passed. And I agree that's probably true to some extent. I don't know how great of an extent, but I also do believe that the government does a poor job with our tax dollars, so keeping a little bit extra for ourselves, I think, is a better option. So I'm going to be voting yes on this one. Moving on to Amendment 6, which is repeal of public campaign financing. The ballot language reads, proposing the repeal of the provision in the state constitution which requires public financing for campaigns of candidates for elective statewide office who agree to campaign spending limits. Voting yes on this amendment would actually repeal the current Florida Constitution provision that provides public funds to candidates for statewide offices, which would be governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, chief financial officer, and commissioner of agriculture. And of course, voting no would maintain the current provision in place and nothing would change, and the candidates would still keep public financing for statewide positions. People who support this amendment believe that taxpayer dollars should not be used for election purposes, and that voting yes on this would in turn lower the taxes for Floridians and allocate general revenue funds on other important issues within the state. Whereas opponents of this amendment contend that by giving money to candidates that they may not already have money for or the capacity to raise their own money, repealing the current provision could significantly hurt and damage candidates' chances to a level playing field if the candidate is an aspiring officeholder that lacks political and financial connections, especially if they are running against somebody who's already well known within the political theater. I agree with this sentiment, and that's why I'll be voting no on this amendment. I believe we need to keep the playing field as even as possible, and I think the best way to do that is the ability to offer public funds to anybody who's running for those offices, whether they be someone who's already deeply entrenched in the political theater or someone like you or myself who may have never run for office before but would like to and don't typically have the money ourselves to support a candidacy. I believe that voting yes on this just keeps the same players that are already in the system in play and just supports the good old boys system, which I think could lead to the only options for political candidacy being bad options. In order to keep our options open and potentially provide ourselves, the state of Florida, with the opportunity to vote for candidates that are, well, worth a damn, I think public funding is necessary. So again, I'll be voting no on this one. And that wraps it up. We've gone over all the 6 amendments that are being proposed on the Florida ballot for this general election this year of 2024. And now we're going to move on to other topics in our future episodes. We're going to try and do 1 to 2 episodes a week, no more than 30 minutes at a time. Unless we have a guest who happens to be pretty interesting and the conversation's going well, then it might go longer than 30. Otherwise, that's it for today, and thanks again for listening. Be sure to hit that follow or subscribe button to continue following us and listening to our podcast. I promise we'll get better and more interesting with each episode. Thank you for listening in with the Central Mind Podcast. My name's Tony DeVito, and we'll see you next time.